They'd worked tirelessly for years to build their American dream.
They saved money for a couple of years, and they were eventually able to purchase a gas station.
They seemed like a very loving couple and a good team.
The whole family was really nice and caring.
But in an instant, 4 members of this hard-working immigrant family are wiped out.
All 4 found in the house were shot multiple times, mostly in the head.
They're on the ground, they're bleeding. Somebody help me, please!
He had no idea what had happened.
Could a bad business deal be behind this brutal massacre?
There was a land deal dispute that was going on back in India.
The community did acknowledge that there is some corruption.
He must have hired somebody black, and so what my feeling is.
They threatened him. They say, you got to back out of this thing or else you will lose your life.
Or were the motives for this crime much closer to home?
Let me see your hands! Hands!
He was acting strange since these murders occurred.
You're treating me like I am the criminal.
She knew it's going to happen.
He owed him a large sum of cash.
The bottom line is sex and money.
This was a very cold, calculated murder.
April 28th, 2019. It's a warm spring Sunday in Westchester Township, Ohio, about 20 miles north of downtown Cincinnati.
It is a very well-to-do area. It is a fast-growing area. It has good schools, it has good jobs.
It's kind of an up-and-coming area here in Ohio.
Westchester also offers an escape from the safety concerns that come with living in the big city.
The crime rate is very low, which really makes this a safe environment.
So it's unusual when a flurry of 911 calls comes in to Westchester Police around 9:45 p.m. that evening.
911, where's your emergency?
I hear gunshots. I've heard 5 now.
The calls are coming from an apartment complex on the west side of town.
Some guy is running around banging all the doors. He just doesn't sound right.
As officers race to the scene, one more call comes into 911. This time from 36-year-old Indian immigrant Gurpreet Singh.
My wife, my family are on the ground. They're bleeding.
Gurpreet is extremely emotional. Police suspect he's the man who's been banging on neighbors' doors for help.
Somebody help me, please!
When first responders arrive at the apartment complex, they proceed with caution.
The apartment unit was on the bottom floor, all the way in the back of the apartment complex.
Gurpreet is outside waiting for them.
Let me see your hands! Hands!
As officers approach Gurpreet, they see he's covered in blood.
Down on the ground! Down on the ground! Down on the ground! Lay on your belly!
At this point, police are unsure if Gurpreet is a victim in this crime or a potential suspect.
Leave my wife! Leave my wife, please! I got cover. You handcuff.
Gurpreet begs police to help his wife, Shalinderjeet Kaur, who's still inside the apartment.
The alarm going off, we're gonna be going in.
Can they help Shalinderjeet before it's too late?
For Indian native Shalinderjeet Kaur, nothing was more important than faith and family.
She was really nice. She was really caring.
Her parents, Hakika and Paramjit, had raised her as a devout member of the Sikh faith.
Sikh means learner. We believe in all humanity as a one, regardless who they are. Everyone belongs to God. We are supposed to work hard with our own hands and share with others who need it.
Another tenet of the Sikh faith is arranged marriage,
which is how Shalinderjeet met her husband, Gurpreet Singh, in March of 2002.
Shalinderjeet's parents knew Gurpreet's parents from the Sikh community, and together they decided the two would be a perfect match.
They met first time at their wedding. There were a lot of people there. There were singers. She was really looking pretty.
And after the wedding, it seemed like the couple was meant to be.
These two got along. They really enjoyed being with each other.
They seem like a very loving couple and a good team.
They eventually had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Shalinderjeet stayed home with the kids while Gurpreet worked in long-haul trucking.
With Gurpreet on the road often, Shalinderjeet's loving parents, Haqiqat and Parmjeet, moved in to help with the children.
The whole family was really nice and caring.
Haqiqat and Gurpreet were also trying to open up a business together to bring in another stream of income.
They saved money for a couple of years, and they were eventually able to purchase a gas station.
Together, the family was making strides towards a bright future.
They were really working together as a team.
But now, investigators are making their way inside the family's apartment and fearing the worst.
Based on the 911 call from Gurpreet, it sounds like there's been a massacre inside this apartment.
And once inside, a gruesome scene is revealed.
They're searching with their guns drawn, and they're encountering several victims.
Gurpreet's entire family is dead.
Indian natives Shalinderjeet Kaur and Gurpreet Singh had built their own American dream in Westchester Township, Ohio, with the help of Shalinderjeet's parents, Haqiqat and Parmjeet. But on April 28, 2019, local police have just discovered a bloody scene inside the family's apartment.
In the kitchen, they find the body of Gurpreet's wife, Shalinderjeet.
She was shot multiple times in the head, both from front to back and on the side of her head.
It appeared that she had been cooking food when she was murdered.
This is what set the fire alarm off right here.
In the living room, there are 2 more female victims.
Both of them have been shot in the head multiple times as well. I mean, this was complete overkill.
There were a bunch of 9mm shell casings throughout the apartment.
But the carnage doesn't end there.
There's a 4th victim in one of the bedrooms.
He was found in his bed with the sheets kind of pulled up to his neck still, and he had been shot, I believe, 6 times in the face. It was a very grisly, very awful scene for law enforcement to encounter, a very traumatic way for these folks to die, just horrific.
It's obvious that this happened very quickly. The entire family must have been gunned down in a matter of seconds before anyone had the chance to run or defend themselves.
As police continue processing the inside of the apartment, another officer is outside speaking with the sole survivor of this massacre, 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh.
I got to get information out of you to be able to help everybody involved, okay? So you're very, very important to me right now, okay? And I'm not trying to be rude or anything like that, but the more info I get, the better I can do my job, okay? Yes. Okay. Who all lives in the building?
Gurpreet explains that along with his wife and 3 children, he shares the apartment with his mother and father-in-law, Parmjeet Kaur and Haqiqat Singh Panag.
He also explains that his wife's aunt, Amaji Kaur, had been staying with them during an extended visit to the United States. So this explains who the other 3 victims are inside the apartment.
Gurpreet says, thankfully, his 3 children are currently with other relatives.
They were going to take them out for dinner and to see a movie and get ice cream.
Not right now, sir. Everybody inside is deceased. That's why it's very, very important for you to hold together and help me out so we can figure out what happened tonight, okay? I need you to be strong for me, okay?
At that point, Gurpreet is transported back to police headquarters to meet with homicide detectives and give an official statement.
When detectives walk into the room to begin their interview with Gurpreet, it's obvious that he's still in a hysterical state about what had just occurred.
Sorry for your loss. It was very important that we get some information from you, okay?
Okay. At this point, he's going through the emotional trauma, starting to realize that his entire family is dead.
But the question still remains, is he the one that killed them?
Detectives ask Gurpreet to walk them through the evening leading up to the shooting.
I was home all day because my back was hurting.
He explained that he spent most of the day lying down.
Gurpreet starts to feel better later in the evening, decides to leave out, as he says, around 7 o'clock, and go and work on his truck.
Gurpreet explains that his semi-truck needed some maintenance before his next long-haul run.
He was having an issue with the lights on the truck, and he really wanted to work on that.
Once he finished, went and got some gas, and he headed home just before 10 o'clock that night.
When he came back, the door was open to his apartment. He said that was not unusual because especially when they cook in that apartment, they keep the door open.
But Gurpreet says when he walked inside the apartment, the sight that greeted him was anything but usual.
That's when he made the gruesome discovery of his family members.
He tried to get her to respond, but he was unsuccessful. That's why he had blood all over him.
Somebody help me, please!
At that point, Gurpreet says he went into panic mode.
Afterwards, he went yelling and screaming to the neighbors, trying to ask everyone to call 911, asking for help.
Some guy is running around banging all the doors.
It's been all such a blur.
Gurpreet pleads with the detectives to find the person who killed his family.
Detectives asked him who could have done this, and he told them his family didn't have any issues or problems with anyone.
He said that he could not think of a single person who would have ever done this.
There was no reason why anybody would want to do this to his family. They asked Mr. Singh if his marriage was good, if anybody had cheated on anybody or something that could cause strain on the relationship.
Gurpreet adamantly denied having any issues whatsoever with his wife. He called her a good woman.
She was amazing. We loved each other very much.
To detectives, Gurpreet Singh seems like a broken man. But is there more to the story?
As they're escorting him out of the interview room, investigators tell Gurpreet they need to collect the bloody clothing he's been wearing since he was placed in custody at the scene.
They also asked Gurpreet to swab his hands to see if he had gunshot residue.
I've been telling everything you wanted to ask me.
Hey, we're gonna get...
Sir, please.
They say it's just a step that we have to go to make sure that you're not a suspect in this case.
So investigators are taken aback when his entire demeanor changes.
He refuses to consent to the swabs of his hands, and Gurpreet suddenly becomes very hostile.
No, you have to stay here.
Why?
Because I said so.
No.
After wrapping up their interview with 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh regarding the brutal massacre of his family, investigators are surprised when his demeanor suddenly shifts.
At the end of the interview, they tell him they need to do a gunshot residue test on his hands, but he's not having it.
He refuses to consent to the swabs of his hands, and so ultimately the police had to obtain a search warrant.
Sir, please.
We are going to get a search warrant for your hand.
Please.
You have to stay here.
Please. No, get your search warrant. Come to me. Do whatever
you have to stay here.
Why?
Because I said so.
No.
We were getting a search warrant.
What was a very low-key interview with Gurpreet suddenly becomes very hostile.
He just kind of loses it at this point. He's very rowdy and cantankerous.
You're treating me like I am the criminal.
I'm not saying you did anything wrong, but you're the first guy to show up where 4 people have been murdered. If we have certain evidence we need to get, if it exists.
Gurpreet is ready to walk out, and he says that he needs to go home and take care of his children.
No matter how detectives try to explain it to Gurpreet, he refuses to consent to the gunshot residue test willingly.
You're not allowed to leave.
Why?
Because
under what crime I do?
you have potential evidence on you that we need to get with a search warrant.
Finally, detectives get a signed search warrant from a judge, and Gurpreet complies.
They really don't have any evidence to hold him at this point, so he's free to leave after they do the gunshot residue test.
Once the test has been sent to the crime lab, detectives can't help but wonder, was Gurpreet's refusal to cooperate the innocent behavior of an exhausted, broken-hearted man? Or something more nefarious?
It's normal and natural for family members to be a bit defensive and emotional at the onset. But you would also think, if you are completely innocent, you want to do everything you can to help investigators quickly find who the suspect is.
He could have just been genuinely offended that in this time of grief, police thought he could be capable of killing his family.
As investigators continue their search for answers, news of the tragic massacre spreads throughout the community.
I was in a car, my family called me and they said, just come home, just come home. That's it. And when I just got home, everybody just came to me and they just hugged me.
My younger brother called me about 6:15 in the morning. I could not believe what he told me. I thought maybe I'm having a nightmare. We lost 4 relatives all of a sudden. Then I started shaking, I was crying, and I could not stand.
But Ajaib also has information he believes could prove crucial to the investigation.
After the initial shock wore off, he went down to the station to meet with investigators.
Ajaib explains that his deceased relatives had recently been involved in a tense land dispute with an Indian real estate investor named Satinder Bhatia.
Namely, Gurpreet's father-in-law, Hakikat, had some bad blood with this man.
He got into deal with the Hakikat because Hakikat was selling his land in India.
Hakikat had a big property in India. It was multi-million property there.
But after Hakikat had already signed over the land to Satinder, the deal went awry.
What happened was a recession hit, and therefore he couldn't purchase the land.
And Satinder had other debts to pay.
He was involved in illegal activity here in US. He had committed some serious crime, but he fled to India before FBI could arrest him. They are drug charges here in the US.
Ajaib explains that regardless of Satinder's refusal to cooperate, Hakikat was determined to get his land back.
He was saying, give me the money, I will transfer ownership because this is the contract we wrote.
It was becoming very contentious because Satinder was not bending or transferring ownership of the land back to Hakikat, but he also wasn't paying for it.
So Hakikat decided to get the courts involved.
Hakikat filed a case in the court, and court decided in favor of Hakikat.
Satinder and his associates were furious.
They threatened him. They say, you got to back out of this thing or else you will lose your life.
Now, had Satinder followed through on his violent claims?
Ajaib tells the detectives that he wouldn't be surprised if somebody in that land dispute might be trying to hurt the family.
They must have hired somebody. That is what my feeling is.
Thanks to Ajaib Singh, detectives have uncovered a possible motive behind the brutal execution-style murders of 39-year-old Salinder Jeet Kaur, her parents Parmjeet and Hakikat, and her aunt Armajit.
The family had recently been involved in a tense land dispute and legal battle with a dangerous real estate investor named Satinder Bhatia.
Detectives were wondering if a hit was put out to eliminate an entire family opposed to selling things in court in India over the land.
They must have hired somebody. That is what my feeling is.
This kind of lines up with the idea that maybe it was a skilled assassin that tried to take out this entire family.
In fact, Ajaib reveals that he spoke with his sister Armajit just hours before the murders, and she didn't seem like herself.
She called around about 6:40, 6:45 in the evening. She was saying that she was scared at that time. She was talking, but she wanted to get out of that place like immediately. I could see, from her voice and from her sound that she was scared for something. Something was about to happen. She knew it's going to happen. She's thinking that she's going to die.
Ajaib says he could have never imagined his sister's dark premonitions would come true.
A little after 9 o'clock, I called her, and I called her 2 or 3 times. There was no answer. Then I thought maybe she's gone to bed. I did not know what happened to my relatives.
But if the massacre of this family was really part of a coordinated hit by Satinder Bhatia, why did he let Gurpreet Singh live?
He's still on their radar. Gurpreet's response when he was asked for that whole gunshot residue test made them wonder, maybe they do need to look into him a little bit further.
And when investigators ask Ajaib about Gurpreet, he admits he too had noticed some strange behavior from his niece's husband.
He conveys to investigators that Gurpreet actually was acting strange since these murders occurred.
Gurpreet, since the murders, has not reached out to any of his deceased wife's family, which is very unusual in their community.
I'm not funny, but traditionally back in India, when wife dies, husband or husband's family contacts wife's immediate relatively right away. I had to cremate them, I had to arrange everything. I had to go to the place where I did not know anyone. That was awful, awful. No brother should see a day where he has to cremate 2 sisters and a niece.
However, despite Gurpreet's strange behavior, Ajaib says he doesn't think his niece's husband is capable of gunning down his own family.
To do this thing, the gruesome murder, I don't think he can do it.
After their interview with Ajaib, detectives reach out to other members of the local Sikh community to learn more about Satinder Bhatia, but their lead quickly loses steam.
They didn't believe that Satinder would have enough connection, enough pull to reach the family here in the United States.
The community did acknowledge that there is some corruption in India, but to plan a quadruple murder in the United States takes some significant reach.
However, friends of the family offer up another potential motive, one that could flip the entire case on its head.
It was very well known in the Sikh community that Gurpreet was having an affair.
If this extramarital affair is true, now Gurpreet has a motive to murder his wife.
Ohio investigators have just learned that 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh was having an affair in the months leading up to his wife Sharlinderjeet Kaur's death.
It was very well known in the Sikh community that Gurpreet was having an affair.
There were other friends who said that they were aware of the affair, and the implication was always that the affair was something that Sharlinderjeet knew about.
Where have you been?
I was just working on my truck.
We were advising Sharlinderjeet to leave, and she would not leave.
She never left Gurpreet because she don't want to ruin the life of the kids.
Who is she, Gurpreet? Don't lie to me.
I'm telling the truth. There's nobody else.
Nobody in the community could give detectives the name of the person. But if this extramarital affair is true, now Gurpreet has a motive to murder his wife.
Hoping to get some definitive answers, detectives subpoena Gurpreet's phone records and discover that he has been in regular communication with a woman named Jasmeet Beatty.
She was a woman who lived in Indianapolis, and she had been divorced in 2018.
Indianapolis is one of the stops that Gurpreet often makes on his truck route.
When detectives reach out to Jasmeet, she seems shocked and saddened by the circumstances of their call.
I just can't believe this. Gurpreet must be devastated.
She confirms that she and Gurpreet are very good friends. She met Gurpreet through a relative who's also a truck driver, and when he's in the Indianapolis area, they meet up, but there's nothing more than that.
Has the relationship ever been romantic in nature?
With Gurpreet? No, of course not.
She said she does not have any type of sexual relationship with Gurpreet.
We're just friends.
Friends that have a lot of contact over the phone, it seems.
When detectives continue pressing her about her relationship with Gurpreet, she finally starts to cave and tell them the truth.
Okay, fine.
She just breaks down and tells them everything. That, yes, she was having an affair with Gurpreet.
She's coming clean. She says he spends a lot of money on me, and we're talking lavish gifts. $20,000 for a down payment on a home, paying the mortgage, buying a vehicle for her.
He's always there when I need him.
Perhaps most shocking of all, Jasmeet tells detectives that Gurpreet had bought his own home in Indianapolis, just down the road from hers.
He bought a house near her so that he can stay near her when he is in town driving his truck.
So while his wife's family, and the children were living in a very cramped apartment, Gurpreet's mistress was living a life of luxury.
He's actually planning to move here full time.
Jasmeet told investigators that Gurpreet had planned to move his family to Indianapolis to be closer to her while still basically living this double life.
Based on everything detectives have learned, it certainly sounds like Gurpreet had reason to want Shailenderjeet and his in-laws out of the picture.
However, Jasmeet assures investigators there's no way Gurpreet could have committed the murders.
Gurpreet is a kind, loving man. He would never kill his family.
She says she can't imagine him doing such a thing.
But after speaking with Jasmeet, detectives uncover even more information pointing towards Gurpreet.
Gurpreet was furious with his father-in-law, Hakikat.
Their dispute centered around the gas station business they'd started together, a business that eventually tanked.
It was a complete failure, and Gurpreet blamed that on Hakikat.
Gurpreet believed his father-in-law owed him a large sum of cash.
Gurpreet said he was out $100,000.
I want my money.
How you can't say that? We made these decisions together. Part of the reason Hakikat had gotten involved with Satinder Bhatia was in an attempt to pay back Gurpreet.
Gurpreet always wanted that money. So he pressured Hakikat to sell that property so he can get all that money.
Witnesses claimed that Gurpreet had actually beaten Hakikat during one of their arguments about the funds.
Gurpreet was cheating on his wife, and his father-in-law owed him a large sum of cash. This was sufficient reasons to murder everyone.
And when the results of Gurpreet's gunshot residue test come in, they're the nail in his coffin.
That test revealed the presence of gunshot residue on both of Gurpreet Singh's hands.
What it means is he fired a gun.
The evidence is enough for investigators to obtain an arrest warrant for Gurpreet on 4 counts of aggravated murder. However, when police go looking for their suspect, they run into a problem.
Gurpreet is nowhere to be found.
There was some concern that he might be fleeing the United States.
By July of 2019, Ohio police have zeroed in on 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh for the brutal quadruple murder of his wife, Shailendrajit Kaur, and her family members.
This was a violent crime, the likes of which the community had never seen before. When everyone realized Gurpreet had done this to his own family, it was stunning.
It has affected us tremendously. It's hard to describe how bad it has affected us. We were really shocked.
Now, police are ready to arrest Gurpreet for the crime. But there's just one problem.
Gurpreet is nowhere to be found, and neither are his children.
Weeks go by, but finally, thanks to tips from the local Sikh community, detectives learn that Gurpreet has moved out of Ohio in the wake of the murders.
By that time, he had moved his children to the house that he had built and purchased in Indianapolis.
The same house that was just down the street from his mistress, Jasmeet.
Homicide.
But when detectives coordinate with their counterparts in Indianapolis to make an arrest, Gurpreet disappears again.
What do you mean he's not there?
There was some concern that he might be fleeing the area, and so law enforcement wanted to arrest him before he'd have an opportunity to leave the United States.
Thankfully, on July 2nd, 2019, more than 2 months after the murders, Ohio police finally receive a solid tip about Gurpreet's whereabouts.
Investigators learned that Gurpreet is in Connecticut for a family wedding.
Put your hands up!
He was arrested just outside a shopping center in Connecticut.
But once he's in police custody, Gurpreet refuses to say anything more to detectives.
Gurpreet did not make any statements one way or the other to police, and he hasn't really said a word about this case since then.
Let's go. Come on.
Regardless, investigators charge him with 4 counts of aggravated murder.
After more than 3 years of COVID-19 pandemic delays, Gurpreet's trial begins in October 2022. Prosecutors seek the death penalty, arguing Gurpreet's motive was twofold: eliminating his wife for another woman, and anger at his father-in-law over money.
Gurpreet was having trouble keeping up the elaborate double life he'd created for himself.
All that time demanding money, more and more money. His greed continued to go on and on and on.
To Gurpreet's dismay, his mistress, Jasmeet Bedi, takes the stand to bolster the prosecution's case.
She confirmed that she was in a relationship with Gurpreet, and he was spending thousands and thousands of dollars on her.
According to prosecutors, on April 28, 2019, Gurpreet's dire situation reached a tipping point.
Gurpreet was getting desperate. He was running out of money, and if he didn't do something soon, this secret double life he'd built would be exposed.
Prosecutors argue that Gurpreet plotted the murders carefully, first making arrangements for the children to spend the evening with relatives.
Hey, can I drop off the kids with you for a little while?
Then he went to do some work on his truck in an effort to establish an alibi.
Prosecutor said when he got home after working on his truck at 9 p.m., that he just unleashed fury on his family.
The prosecution actually created a 3D model to illustrate the carnage that had happened inside that apartment.
When Gurpreet arrived home at 9 p.m., he went straight to the back bedroom where Haqiqat was sleeping.
They believe that because of the dispute that he had with him, that he was the first victim in the bedroom.
He never got out of bed. He was asleep and never saw or heard the first shot coming.
6 of those bullets went into the head of Hockey Cat. It speaks to a level of rage and a level of anger.
After his father-in-law was dead, prosecutors say Gurpreet returned to the living room where Parmjeet and Amarjeet had been watching TV.
Investigators believe they had been trying to flee when Gurpreet shot them. They must have heard the shots from the bedroom and knew something was wrong.
Lastly, Gurpreet made his way to the kitchen where his wife had been cooking dinner.
She must have heard everything else that happened and been completely terrified. No one saw this coming.
Gurpreet, what have you done?
This was a very personal, this was a very angry, this was a very cold, calculated murder. His own wife had a double tap entry wound to her skull.
After gunning down his family, Gurpreet knew he needed to get rid of the murder weapon and disposed of it in a nearby pond.
A neighbor described shortly after hearing gunfire a loud splash coming from the pond behind the apartment complex.
After Gurpreet's arrest, investigators searched the pond by the apartment complex and located a 9mm handgun.
The forensic scientists were able to conclusively demonstrate that the gun that was found in the pond was the gun that was used to kill all 4 of these people.
After he got rid of the weapon, Gurpreet started setting up his alibi.
He then calls 911, says he has happened upon this crime scene, and from the very beginning, he started a series of lies.
Help me, please!
The 911 call was received at approximately 9:45 p.m. And on that call, Gurpreet saying that he just got home and had called 911 immediately. What we later learned was he had been home since about 9:09 p.m., 30 minutes prior to calling 911.
We also looked at the victims' devices that were found in the residence, and they were using their phones basically until Mr. Singh came home. So we knew that they were alive in the apartment until shortly after he came home.
Although their case is largely circumstantial, prosecutors feel confident the evidence is enough to convict Gurpreet.
All of the evidence very clearly demonstrated that it was Gurpreet and Gurpreet alone who pulled the trigger.
So the entire courtroom is shocked when the jury returns after 2 days of deliberation, hopelessly deadlocked.
11 jurors believed his guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but one particular juror would not be convinced, regardless of what the other jurors told her.
We were expecting that it's a clear-cut case, but it was a mistrial, and it was really shocking.
We just could not believe that how can somebody not convict in this situation when everything pointed to him.
Prosecutors refused to let Gurpreet off the hook that easily, though.
In May 2024, they take him to trial for a second time.
This time, Gurpreet opts for the case to be presented to a panel of 3 judges rather than a jury.
In this instance, the 3-judge panel unanimously agreed that the defendant, Gurpreet Singh, was guilty of the aggravated murder of these 4 people.
He was sentenced to death as the ultimate outcome.
For the family of the victims, it's an overwhelming moment.
That moment when the judge said that, we all were crying because we tried to fight for them. They deserve justice, and they got it.
It was unbelievable. Finally, we got justice.
Still, the outcome doesn't take away from the senselessness of this tragedy.
The bottom line is sex and money. That's why he committed it.
To do this and then lie about it and carry on a relatively normal life afterwards, it really just speaks to the sick mind and heart of somebody who could do something like that.
This was a family of kind-hearted, hard-working immigrants who didn't remotely deserve what happened to them.
It's unimaginable. It's hard for us to take this loss, and I miss them. Up to today, I miss them.
Few criminal investigations in American history changed modern policing as profoundly as the case that would eventually become known as the Golden State Killer investigation. For more than 4 decades, law enforcement agencies across California pursued an offender responsible for a series of violent crimes that occurred between the mid-1970s and the mid-1980s. During much of that period, investigators did not realize that crimes committed in different communities under different names were connected to the same individual. It was only through advances in forensic science, DNA analysis, and years of collaborative investigative work that authorities were able to identify the offender as Joseph James D'Angelo, leading to his arrest in April 2018. Understanding how the investigation unfolded requires looking first at California during the 1970s. The state was experiencing rapid population growth, expanding suburbs, new residential developments, and increasing mobility transformed communities throughout northern and southern California. Law enforcement agencies generally operated within county or municipal jurisdictions, and communication between departments often depended upon telephone calls, mailed reports, or personal relationships between investigators. Centralized digital databases capable of comparing evidence across jurisdictions did not yet exist. DNA profiling had not been developed, computerized crime analysis was limited, and investigators relied primarily upon witness interviews, fingerprints, physical evidence, patrol activity, and traditional investigative method. During this period, violent crime represented a growing concern throughout the United States. Police departments were adapting to changing patterns of criminal behavior while confronting technological limitations that would later seem remarkable. Crime scene photography remained film-based. Reports were typed or handwritten. Evidence inventories were maintained on paper. Detectives organized case files inside filing cabinets rather than searchable electronic databases. These limitations did not reflect a lack of professionalism, but rather the technological realities of the era. Beginning in 1974, investigators in Visalia, California, documented a series of residential burglaries that displayed unusual characteristics. The offender frequently entered occupied homes, appeared familiar with neighborhood layouts, and sometimes stole inexpensive or seemingly insignificant personal items while leaving valuable property behind. Although investigators recognized recurring behavioral similarities, the full significance of these incidents remained uncertain. At the time, no evidence conclusively established that these crimes were connected to later offenses elsewhere in California. By 1976, authorities in the Sacramento area began investigating a series of home invasion sexual assaults committed by an unknown offender. Because the attacks occurred within the eastern portion of Sacramento County, investigators and the media eventually referred to the unknown suspect as the East Area Rapist. Detectives noted recurring patterns in the offender's methods, including careful surveillance of neighborhoods, nighttime entries into occupied residences, and efforts to control victims through planning and intimidation. These similarities suggested that many of the attacks had been committed by the same individual. As reports accumulated, investigators faced a series of practical challenges. The offender frequently left limited physical evidence. Witness descriptions varied because many victims observed only partial features under stressful conditions and poor lighting. Neighborhood canvases generated hundreds of leads, but few definitive answers. Detectives interviewed potential suspects, examined vehicles reported near crime scenes, analyzed fingerprints, and evaluated physical evidence collected during forensic examination. Despite these efforts, the offender repeatedly avoided identification. Investigators also observed indications that the offender appeared organized and methodical. Crime scene evidence suggested careful preparation before entering residences and familiarity with residential environments. Detectives considered numerous investigative possibilities regarding the offender's background, occupation, and level of criminal experience. However, these remained investigative hypotheses rather than established facts. Law enforcement agencies continued focusing on evidence that could be independently verified through witness testimony, physical evidence, and documented investigative procedure. One of the most significant limitations confronting investigators during the 1970s involved forensic biology. Although biological evidence could be collected and preserved, modern DNA profiling had not yet been developed. Serological testing could determine blood types and certain biological characteristics, but these methods lacked the individualizing power that DNA analysis would later provide. Consequently, evidence that eventually became central to identifying the offender could not yet fulfill that purpose. Communication among jurisdictions also posed substantial challenges. While investigators exchanged information through meetings, correspondence, and telephone conversation, there was no integrated statewide system capable of rapidly comparing crime scene evidence across numerous agencies. Similar crimes occurring in different counties could remain under separate investigations for extended periods before meaningful connections were recognized. As additional offenses occurred, public concern increased. Communities strengthened neighborhood watch programs, encouraged residents to improve home security, and expanded cooperation with local law enforcement. Police departments increased patrol activity in affected neighborhoods and appealed repeatedly for information from the public. Citizens reported suspicious persons, unfamiliar vehicles, and unusual nighttime activity, producing thousands of investigative leads requiring careful evaluation. Throughout the investigation, detectives demonstrated remarkable persistence despite limited technological resources. Evidence technicians preserved biological material, fingerprints, photographs, footwear impression, and other physical evidence according to the best forensic practices available at the time. Investigators maintained detailed reports documenting witness interviews, timelines, neighborhood searches, and evidence recovery. Although many of these materials did not immediately identify the offender, their preservation proved essential decades later when advances in forensic science created entirely new investigative opportunities. The significance of this early investigative work cannot be overstated. Long before DNA profiling, computerized databases, or investigative genetic genealogy existed, detectives recognized the importance of preserving evidence that future technologies might one day examine more effectively. Their commitment to documentation and evidence management established the scientific foundation upon which later investigators would build. At the time, however, none of those future developments could be anticipated. The unknown offender remained unidentified. Investigations continued across multiple jurisdictions. Detectives pursued every credible lead available while confronting the practical limitations of contemporary forensic science. The case would ultimately become one of the most extensive and influential cold case investigations in American history, not because of a single investigative breakthrough, but because generations of investigators preserved evidence, maintained institutional knowledge, and continued searching for answers until scientific progress finally made identification possible more than 40 years after the crimes began. By late 1976 and throughout 1977, investigators in Sacramento County recognized that they were confronting an offender whose methods demonstrated an unusual degree of consistency. Individual incidents initially appeared isolated, but as detectives compared reports, common behavioral characteristics became increasingly apparent. Similar entry methods, patterns of surveillance, timing of offenses, and approaches to avoiding detection suggested that many of the crimes were likely committed by the same individual. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office assumed a leading role in coordinating the investigation, although numerous municipal police departments and neighboring agencies contributed personnel and resources. Detectives established specialized investigative teams to review witness statements, compare physical evidence, and identify recurring patterns. The volume of information grew rapidly. Each new investigation generated photographs, diagrams, laboratory reports, evidence inventories, neighborhood canvases, and interview records that had to be organized and evaluated. Without modern computerized case management systems, investigators relied on paper files, index cards, wall maps, and manually maintained timelines. Detectives marked the locations of reported incidents on large maps to identify geographic patterns. They compared dates, times, weather conditions, access routes, and neighborhood characteristics in an effort to determine whether the offender demonstrated consistent operational habit. Geographic analysis was largely manual, requiring investigators to synthesize information through repeated review of physical records. Witness interviews became one of the investigation's primary sources of information. Detectives spoke with victims, neighbors, family members, delivery personnel, utility workers, and anyone who might have observed suspicious activity before or after an incident. Although many witnesses described seeing unfamiliar individuals or vehicles, the information often differed in significant ways. Variations in lighting, distance, stress, and observation time affected the reliability of description. Investigators therefore evaluated each statement carefully while avoiding conclusions based on any single account. Crime scene investigators continued collecting physical evidence whenever possible: fingerprints, shoe impressions, fibers, biological material, and other trace evidence were documented according to accepted forensic procedure. Laboratory scientists examined these materials using the analytical methods available during the 1970s. While these examinations occasionally eliminated investigative possibilities or established associations among crime scenes, they could not yet identify an unknown offender with the precision later achieved through DNA profiling. Behavioral analysis also became an increasingly important investigative tool. Detectives noted that the offender appeared to spend considerable time selecting locations and understanding neighborhood layouts before committing crime. Reports suggested repeated activity within residential areas before incidents occurred. Investigators considered whether the offender possessed knowledge of local communities through employment, residence, recreation, or other routine activity. These possibilities informed investigative planning, but remained hypotheses requiring corroboration rather than established fact. Public participation became an essential component of the investigation. Law enforcement agencies encouraged residents to report suspicious persons, unusual vehicles, prowlers, or other activity that might assist detectives. Community meetings were held in affected neighborhoods to discuss crime prevention and explain investigative effort. Newspapers, television stations, and radio broadcasters regularly reported developments, increasing public awareness while also generating thousands of additional tips that required evaluation. As information accumulated, investigators faced a familiar challenge encountered in many major investigations: distinguishing credible leads from background information. Most reported suspicious activity ultimately proved unrelated to the offender. Nevertheless, detectives documented each report because seemingly insignificant observations occasionally became more meaningful when viewed alongside later evidence. Interagency communication expanded as investigators recognized that similar crimes might extend beyond Sacramento County. Detectives exchanged reports, compared investigative findings, and met with personnel from neighboring jurisdictions to determine whether additional incidents shared common characteristics. Although communication technologies remained limited compared with modern standards, these cooperative efforts represented important steps toward recognizing broader crime patterns across California. The investigation also highlighted the limitations of forensic science during the period. Biological evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes was preserved because investigators understood its potential evidentiary value. However, the scientific techniques available at the time were limited primarily to serological testing and blood group analysis. These methods could assist investigators in certain circumstances but lacked the discriminatory power of DNA profiling, which would not become available until years later. As the investigation continued, detectives maintained extensive documentation describing each incident in detail. Reports included scene photographs, sketches, evidence inventories, witness interviews, investigative actions, and laboratory findings. This documentation served immediate investigative needs while also preserving information for future review. Although investigators could not know it at the time, these carefully maintained records would later become invaluable as forensic technology advanced. Another notable aspect of the investigation involved the systematic review of potential suspects. Detectives examined individuals whose backgrounds, locations, or circumstances appeared consistent with available evidence. Interviews were conducted, records were reviewed, and investigative leads were pursued according to the legal standards of the time. Like many major investigations, the inquiry generated numerous persons of interest, but none could be conclusively linked to the crimes using the evidence then available. The expanding investigation also influenced policing practices beyond Sacramento. Agencies throughout California monitored developments closely, recognizing that understanding the offender's methods could assist local officers responding to suspicious activity. Information sharing gradually improved, laying the groundwork for greater statewide cooperation in later years. Perhaps the most enduring contribution of this phase of the investigation was the preservation of evidence and institutional knowledge. Detectives continued collecting physical evidence despite the absence of technology capable of fully exploiting it. Crime laboratories preserved biological samples using accepted procedures. Investigative files remained organized and accessible. These professional practices reflected an understanding that unresolved investigations might benefit from future scientific advances. From today's perspective, it is evident that the investigative teams of the late 1970s operated under constraints very different from those faced by modern law enforcement. There were no national DNA databases, no digital evidence management systems, no geographic information software, and no investigative genetic genealogy. Progress depended upon meticulous documentation, careful comparison of reports, cooperation among agencies, and sustained investigative persistence. Although the offender remained unidentified during this period, the work completed by detectives established the evidentiary foundation for later breakthroughs. Every preserved exhibit, every documented interview, every crime scene photograph, and every laboratory record contributed to a growing body of information that future investigators would revisit decades later. When advances in forensic science finally created new opportunities for identification, those historical records and preserved evidence became indispensable components of one of the most significant cold case investigations in American criminal justice history. As investigators continued examining violent crimes committed in Northern California during the late 1970s, an increasingly important question emerged. Were multiple law enforcement agencies investigating the same offender without realizing it? At the time, this possibility was difficult to confirm. Police departments generally maintained independent investigative files, and statewide information sharing systems remained limited. Detectives relied on telephone conversations, mailed reports, professional meetings, and personal contacts to exchange information. The absence of integrated digital databases meant that recognizing connections between crimes often depended on the experience and persistence of individual investigators. The challenge was compounded by geography. California is one of the largest states in the United States, with hundreds of local law enforcement agencies operating under separate jurisdictions. Crimes occurring in Sacramento County, Contra Costa County, Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Orange County, or Southern California could initially appear unrelated simply because they were investigated by different agencies using separate reporting systems. Coordinating investigations across such a large geographic area required sustained communication and careful comparison of evidence. During this period, detectives increasingly recognized recurring behavioral patterns that appeared in investigations conducted by different agencies. Similar methods of entering residences, selecting locations, avoiding detection, and leaving crime scenes prompted investigators to consider whether a single offender could be responsible for offenses occurring across multiple regions. Behavioral similarities alone, however, could not establish that the crimes had been committed by the same person. Investigators required corroborating physical evidence and carefully documented investigative findings before drawing such conclusions. Behavioral analysis during the late 1970s differed substantially from modern criminal profiling. Investigators focused primarily on observable actions documented at crime scenes rather than psychological interpretation. Crime scene photographs, evidence inventories, witness statements, timelines, and physical observations formed the basis of comparison. Detectives examined whether entry methods, movement through residences, evidence left behind, and patterns of preparation demonstrated consistent characteristics across multiple investigations. Crime laboratories continued processing physical evidence using the best available scientific techniques. Fingerprint comparisons remained one of the most valuable identification methods available to investigators. Latent print examiners compared ridge characteristics manually, evaluating whether fingerprints recovered from crime scenes matched known individuals or other recovered impressions. Although fingerprint identification has long been considered a reliable forensic discipline when properly conducted, investigators did not obtain the definitive identification needed to resolve the investigation during this period. Trace evidence also received careful examination. Laboratory scientists analyzed hairs, fibers, shoe impressions, and other microscopic materials recovered from crime scenes. These examinations occasionally supported associations between evidence and particular locations or objects, but they generally lacked sufficient discriminatory power to identify an unknown offender independently. Nevertheless, every examination contributed additional information to the growing investigative record. Another significant limitation involved forensic biology. Biological evidence collected from multiple crime scenes remained scientifically important, but available serological testing could provide only limited information compared with DNA profiling developed years later. Investigators therefore preserved biological samples whenever possible, recognizing their potential future value despite existing technological limitations. As investigative information accumulated, detectives increasingly emphasized systematic record organization. Case files expanded to include thousands of pages of documentation consisting of witness interviews, laboratory reports, crime scene diagrams, evidence inventories, investigative memoranda, and correspondence among agencies. Maintaining these records required considerable administrative effort, but proved essential for long-term investigative continuity. Public assistance remained another important investigative resource. Law enforcement agencies regularly appealed for information through newspapers, television broadcasts, and community meetings. Citizens reported suspicious activity, unfamiliar vehicles, and possible sightings. While most tips ultimately proved unrelated, investigators documented each report because seemingly insignificant information occasionally became relevant when viewed alongside later evidence. The growing scale of the investigation encouraged stronger cooperation among California law enforcement agencies. Detectives met periodically to compare investigative findings, discuss emerging patterns, and exchange information regarding potential suspects. These meetings reflected an increasing recognition that complex investigations extending across multiple jurisdictions required collaborative rather than isolated approaches. Although computerized criminal intelligence systems remained limited, investigators began adopting more structured methods for organizing information. Wall maps displayed incident locations, timelines tracked reported offenses chronologically, and comparative charts summarized recurring investigative characteristics. These manual analytical techniques represented important predecessors to modern crime analysis software now routinely used by law enforcement agencies. The investigation also highlighted the importance of institutional memory. Detectives assigned to the case frequently transferred, retired, or accepted new responsibilities during the years required to investigate such a large series of crimes. Comprehensive documentation ensured that successor investigators could understand previous investigative actions without repeating completed work. This continuity would later become one of the defining strengths of the investigation. Forensic science itself continued advancing throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Researchers around the world explored new methods of biological identification that would eventually lead to forensic DNA profiling. Although these developments had not yet entered routine criminal investigations, they demonstrated that scientific capabilities were evolving rapidly. Investigators responsible for preserving evidence could not predict precisely how future laboratories might analyze biological material, but maintaining that evidence ensured that future opportunities would remain available. Another lesson emerging from this period involved the importance of multidisciplinary investigation. Detectives increasingly relied upon crime scene specialists, laboratory scientists, fingerprint examiners, evidence custodians, prosecutors, and patrol officers working together rather than independently. Each discipline contributed specialized expertise while supporting a common investigative objective. This collaborative approach later became a standard feature of major homicide and cold case investigations throughout the United States. By the early 1980s, investigators possessed an extensive collection of physical evidence, witness interviews, crime scene documentation, and analytical reports. They had identified recurring behavioral characteristics, strengthened cooperation among agencies, and preserved biological evidence that remained scientifically valuable despite existing technological limitations. Yet the identity of the offender remained unknown. Looking back from the perspective of modern forensic science, this phase of the investigation demonstrates the importance of persistence in criminal investigation. Although investigators lacked the technological tools that would eventually identify the offender, they established a comprehensive evidentiary foundation through careful documentation, systematic evidence preservation, and interagency cooperation. Those efforts ensured that when DNA profiling, computerized databases, and later investigative genetic genealogy became available, future investigators would possess the historical records and preserved evidence necessary to apply those technologies effectively. The investigation therefore represents more than a series of scientific breakthroughs. It illustrates how decades of disciplined police work, performed long before the necessary forensic technology existed, created the conditions that ultimately made identification possible. The combination of meticulous documentation, careful evidence preservation, and sustained collaboration across multiple jurisdictions became one of the defining characteristics of one of the most influential. By the early 1980s, investigators across California faced an increasingly complex investigative landscape. Multiple law enforcement agencies had accumulated extensive case files involving violent crimes committed over several years, yet no single department possessed a complete picture of the offender's activities. The investigation had evolved beyond the resources of any individual jurisdiction, making cooperation among agencies increasingly important. At the time, criminal investigations remained largely decentralized. California's municipal police departments, county sheriff's offices, district attorneys, and state agencies each maintained independent reporting systems and evidence repositories. Although professional relationships between investigators encouraged information sharing, there was no statewide digital platform capable of automatically identifying similarities among crimes occurring hundreds of miles apart. This organizational structure reflected the policing practices of the era rather than any investigative deficiency. Detectives worked within their legal jurisdictions while exchanging information through correspondence, meetings, telephone conversations, and professional conferences. As evidence accumulated, these cooperative efforts gradually strengthened, allowing investigators to compare crime scene documentation, witness statements, forensic findings, and investigative observations across multiple counties. One significant challenge involved determining whether crimes committed in different regions actually shared a common offender. Similar methods alone could not establish a connection. Detectives required objective evidence supported by documented investigative findings before concluding that separate investigations should be treated as part of the same criminal series. Consequently, investigators reviewed reports carefully, searching for recurring characteristics while avoiding assumptions unsupported by evidence. Crime analysts increasingly relied upon comparative case review. Investigative teams assembled chronological timelines showing the dates and locations of known offenders. Geographic comparisons identified regional patterns, transportation corridors, and periods during which criminal activity appeared to shift between communities. These analyses were conducted manually using paper records, wall maps, photographs, and handwritten notes methods that required substantial time but often revealed important investigative relationships. Physical evidence continued receiving careful laboratory examination. Fingerprints recovered from crime scenes underwent comparison using established forensic identification techniques. Examiners evaluated ridge detail under magnification, comparing latent impressions against known fingerprint records where available. Although fingerprint analysis remained among the most reliable forensic identification methods of the period, no conclusive identification resulted from these efforts. Trace evidence analysis also contributed to the investigation. Forensic scientists examined hairs, fibers, footwear impressions, and other microscopic materials recovered during evidence collection. These examinations occasionally supported investigative hypotheses or excluded certain possibilities, but generally could not independently identify an unknown offender. Nevertheless, every laboratory report became part of the permanent investigative record. Perhaps the most significant scientific limitation concerned biological evidence. Throughout the investigation, crime scene personnel preserved biological samples according to accepted forensic standards. However, during much of the early 1980s, laboratories still lacked the DNA profiling techniques that would later revolutionize criminal investigation. Investigators recognized the importance of preserving biological material despite uncertainty regarding future analytical capability. Evidence preservation proved especially important because many criminal investigations remain unresolved for extended periods. Proper storage protects biological material from environmental degradation while maintaining chain of custody documentation necessary for future judicial proceeding. Although investigators could not foresee the development of modern DNA analysis, their commitment to evidence preservation ensured that later scientific advances could be applied successfully. The expanding investigation also demonstrated the importance of standardized documentation. Crime scene photographs, evidence inventories, witness interviews, laboratory reports, and investigative memoranda were prepared according to professional procedures intended to preserve factual information accurately. As years passed and personnel changed, these records allowed successive investigators to understand previous investigative actions without repeating completed work. Public communication remained another essential investigative component. Law enforcement agencies regularly requested assistance from residents through press conferences, newspaper interviews, television broadcasts, and community meetings. Citizens reported suspicious activity, unfamiliar individuals, and possible sightings, generating thousands of investigative leads. Detectives evaluated each report systematically, recognizing that even information appearing insignificant initially might later contribute to broader investigative understanding. As cooperation expanded, investigators also exchanged expertise regarding investigative methods. Detectives who had worked particular crime scenes shared observations concerning evidence collection, neighborhood searches, witness interviewing, and crime scene reconstruction. These discussions promoted greater consistency among agencies while strengthening professional collaboration throughout the investigation. The investigation coincided with important developments within forensic science generally. During the early and mid-1980s, molecular biologists conducted research that would eventually lead to practical forensic DNA profiling. In 1984, British geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys developed the first DNA fingerprinting technique, demonstrating that genetic material could uniquely identify individuals under appropriate scientific conditions. Although these methods were not immediately available to American criminal investigations, the scientific breakthrough represented the beginning of a transformation that would fundamentally alter forensic biology. Law enforcement agencies gradually recognized the potential significance of these developments as DNA technology matured during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators began reviewing historical cases involving preserved biological evidence. Cold case investigations that previously lacked sufficient forensic identification methods suddenly acquired new scientific possibilities. Cases once considered unlikely to be solved became candidates for renewed laboratory examination. The Golden State Killer investigation would eventually become one of the most prominent examples of this transformation. However, during the early 1980s, investigators remained focused on traditional police work, witness interviews, physical surveillance, forensic examination, neighborhood canvasses, suspect evaluation, and interagency cooperation continued forming the foundation of the investigation. Scientific breakthroughs capable of identifying the offender still lay years in the future. Looking back, this period illustrates the importance of institutional persistence. Detectives continued investigating despite limited technological resources, preserving evidence, documenting investigative findings, and maintaining communication across jurisdictions. Their work established the comprehensive evidentiary foundation upon which future investigators would later build. When advances in DNA science, computerized record systems, and investigative genetic genealogy finally became available, those historical records and carefully preserved exhibits provided the essential framework for one of the most significant cold case resolutions in American criminal justice history. The investigation therefore demonstrates a broader lesson extending beyond a single criminal case. Successful cold case investigations rarely depend upon one dramatic discovery. Instead, they emerge through decades of disciplined evidence preservation, careful documentation, scientific advancement, and cooperation among generations of investigators committed to pursuing factual answers through objective evidence. The emergence of forensic DNA analysis represents one of the most significant developments in the history of criminal investigation. Before DNA profiling became available during the 1980s, investigators relied primarily on fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, blood typing, hair comparison, fiber analysis, and other forms of physical evidence. These methods often proved valuable, but they had important limitations. Biological evidence recovered from a crime scene could sometimes indicate a person's blood group or other characteristics, yet it generally could not identify one specific individual with the degree of certainty later achieved through DNA analysis. The scientific foundation for forensic DNA identification was established in 1984 when British geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys developed a method of distinguishing individuals based on variations in their DNA. This discovery demonstrated that, with the exception of identical twins, every person possesses a unique genetic profile. Within only a few years, DNA profiling began transforming criminal investigations, first in the United Kingdom and then throughout the United States and many other countries. For law enforcement agencies, DNA offered something previous forensic techniques rarely could: the ability to compare biological material recovered from a crime seen directly with a known individual or another crime scene sample using objective scientific methods. Investigators no longer depended solely upon eyewitness descriptions, confessions, or circumstantial evidence. Biological evidence could now become a powerful source of identification when collected, preserved, and analyzed correctly. The transition to DNA-based investigations occurred gradually during the late 1980s. Laboratories primarily used restriction fragment length polymorphism, RFLP, analysis, which required relatively large amounts of high-quality DNA. Although scientifically reliable, RFLP testing was time-consuming and unsuitable for many degraded or limited biological samples commonly recovered during criminal investigation. Scientific advances during the 1990s introduced polymerase chain reaction PCR technology, allowing laboratories to amplify extremely small quantities of DNA. PCR made it possible to analyze biological material that previously could not be examined successfully. This innovation greatly expanded the range of evidence available for forensic testing and increased the number of historical cases that could benefit from renewed laboratory examination. Another major advancement followed with the widespread adoption of short tandem repeat STR analysis. STR profiling examines specific locations within human DNA where short sequences of genetic material repeat. Because these patterns vary significantly among individuals, comparing multiple STR markers produces an extremely discriminating genetic profile. STR analysis requires relatively small amounts of biological material and performs well even when evidence has experienced some environmental degradation. As laboratories adopted standardized STR methods, law enforcement agencies developed national DNA databases. In the United States, the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, enabled forensic laboratories to compare DNA profiles generated from crime scenes with profiles obtained from convicted offenders, arrestees in jurisdictions where authorized by law, and other forensic evidence. CODIS also allowed investigators to determine whether biological evidence from different crime scenes originated from the same unknown individual, even when investigations occurred in different jurisdictions. This capability fundamentally changed cold case investigations. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades could now be revisited whenever preserved biological evidence existed. Investigators began systematically reviewing historical homicide, sexual assault, and unidentified human remains cases to determine whether advances in DNA analysis might generate new investigative leads. Evidence preservation became increasingly important during this period. Detectives and crime scene personnel who had carefully documented and stored biological evidence years earlier unknowingly created opportunities for future scientific breakthroughs. Clothing, bedding, weapons, swabs, hair samples, and other exhibits collected during earlier investigations frequently became the foundation for renewed forensic analysis. In many instances, the quality of evidence preservation determined whether modern laboratory techniques could be applied successfully. Cold case units emerged within many law enforcement agencies as DNA technology matured. Rather than allowing unresolved investigations to remain permanently inactive, specialized investigators reviewed historical case files, evaluated preserved evidence, identified opportunities for additional laboratory testing, and coordinated with forensic scientists to apply newly available analytical methods. These dedicated units often combined experienced homicide detectives with forensic specialists and prosecutors familiar with complex historical investigations. The Golden State Killer investigation illustrates this broader transformation. Biological evidence collected during crimes committed decades earlier had been preserved according to accepted forensic standards, even though the technology necessary to analyze it effectively did not yet exist. As DNA science advanced, investigators were able to develop increasingly informative genetic profiles from that preserved evidence. Those profiles eventually confirmed that crimes committed in different California jurisdictions were linked to the same offender, strengthening investigators' understanding of the case long before the offender's identity became known. Importantly, DNA evidence rarely functions in isolation. Investigators continue relying upon traditional police work, including witness interviews, documentary research, crime scene reconstruction, surveillance, and background investigation. DNA provides powerful scientific information, but it is most effective when interpreted alongside all available investigative evidence. Successful cold case investigations typically result from the combination of forensic science and conventional detective work rather than either approach alone. Forensic DNA has also played a significant role in correcting investigative errors. In addition to identifying offenders, DNA testing has excluded individuals who were previously considered suspects and has contributed to the exoneration of wrongfully convicted persons. This dual function demonstrates that forensic science serves not only to support prosecutions, but also to improve the overall accuracy and fairness of the criminal justice system. As laboratory capabilities continued advancing into the 21st century, scientists developed increasingly sensitive analytical methods capable of examining degraded biological material, complex DNA mixture, and extremely small quantities of genetic evidence. Improvements in instrumentation, contamination prevention, quality assurance, and statistical interpretation further strengthened the reliability of forensic DNA analysis. The evolution of forensic DNA also influenced investigative strategy. Detectives began recognizing that evidence once considered scientifically insignificant might later become valuable as technology improved. Consequently, agencies placed greater emphasis on comprehensive evidence collection, meticulous documentation, secure long-term storage, and maintaining complete chain of custody records. These practices ensure that future scientific developments can be applied to preserved evidence whenever appropriate. Ultimately, forensic DNA transformed cold case investigations by changing both the science and the philosophy of criminal investigation. Cases once believed unsolvable became candidates for renewed examination. Biological evidence collected decades earlier acquired new investigative significance. Cooperation among forensic laboratories, law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and scientific researchers expanded dramatically. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most widely recognized examples of this transformation, demonstrating that scientific progress, when combined with careful evidence preservation and persistent investigative work, can provide answers many years after a crime originally occurred. The transformation of cold case investigations through forensic DNA was not a sudden event. It was the result of decades of scientific development, improvements in laboratory standards, and changes in how law enforcement agencies approached unsolved crime. Cases that once appeared permanently unresolved began receiving renewed attention because biological evidence preserved from the original investigations could now provide information that earlier generations of investigators could not obtain. Before DNA analysis became a standard forensic tool, investigators depended on evidence such as fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, physical descriptions, blood type analysis, and circumstantial information. These methods could be valuable, but they often had limitations. A fingerprint might identify an individual if a usable print was recovered. A witness might provide important information if their memory was accurate. Blood typing could exclude certain individuals. However, many investigations reached a point where available evidence could not establish a definitive connection between a suspect and a crime. DNA analysis changed this landscape by introducing a new level of biological identification. The power of forensic DNA comes from the fact that human genetic material contains variations that differ from person to person. Scientists examine specific regions of DNA and compare genetic patterns between biological evidence collected from a crime scene and samples obtained from known individuals. When enough genetic markers are examined, the probability that two unrelated individuals would share the same profile becomes extremely small. The first practical applications of forensic DNA appeared during the 1980s. Early methods demonstrated that biological evidence could be used for identification, but the techniques required relatively large amounts of high-quality DNA. As scientific research advanced, laboratories developed more efficient methods capable of analyzing smaller and older samples. The introduction of polymerase chain reaction, commonly known as PCR, became a major turning point. PCR allowed scientists to create millions of copies of specific sections of DNA from extremely small biological samples. This meant evidence that previously seemed unusable, such as small amounts of biological material recovered from old investigations, could potentially be examined. This development had enormous implications for cold cases. Evidence collected years or even decades earlier could now be reconsidered. Items stored in police evidence facilities, including clothing, biological swabs, weapons, and other exhibits, gained new investigative value. A case that had reached a dead end could be reopened because the scientific tools available to investigators had changed. Another major advancement came with the adoption of short tandem repeat analysis, or STR testing. STR analysis examines specific locations within DNA where short sequences repeat. These regions vary among individuals and create a genetic profile that can be compared between samples. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, STR analysis had become a central component of forensic DNA testing. Laboratories developed standardized procedures, improved quality control, and established statistical methods to explain the significance of DNA findings in court. The creation of national DNA databases further expanded the impact of forensic genetics. In the United States, the Combined DNA Index System, known as C, allowed participating laboratories to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with profiles collected from known individuals according to legal requirements. This represented a fundamental change in criminal investigation. Previously, investigators working on an unsolved case might only compare evidence against suspects already identified through traditional detective work. DNA databases created the possibility that biological evidence from an unknown offender could generate a match years later when that person's DNA profile entered the system. DNA databases also helped reveal connections between separate investigations. If the same unknown DNA profile appeared in evidence from different crime scenes, investigators could determine that those cases were likely connected. This capability allowed agencies in different cities, counties, or states to recognize patterns that might otherwise have remained hidden. For cold case investigators, this new approach required a shift in thinking. An unsolved investigation was no longer necessarily considered inactive. Instead, investigators began reviewing historical cases to determine whether preserved evidence could benefit from modern forensic technique. Many law enforcement agencies created specialized cold case units dedicated to this process. These teams examined old case files, reviewed evidence inventories, consulted forensic laboratories, and identified investigations where additional testing might provide new information. The success of these efforts depended heavily on evidence preservation. DNA technology could only help if biological evidence had survived over time and had been properly documented. Crime scene investigators decades earlier often had no way of knowing how valuable preserved evidence would become in the future. Their careful collection and storage practices created opportunities for later scientific breakthroughs. The evolution of forensic DNA also changed the relationship between investigators and forensic laboratories. Modern investigations increasingly rely on collaboration between detectives and scientists from the earliest stages of a case. Investigators must understand what evidence may be scientifically valuable, while forensic experts help determine which analytical methods are appropriate. Quality control became a central focus as DNA testing expanded. Accredited laboratories established strict procedures to prevent contamination, verify results, maintain equipment, and ensure that conclusions were scientifically supported. Independent reviews became standard practice to strengthen reliability. The influence of forensic DNA extended beyond identifying offenders. DNA technology also played a major role in reviewing wrongful conviction. In some cases, individuals convicted years earlier were excluded through DNA testing, demonstrating that forensic science could serve both investigative and corrective functions within the justice system. However, DNA evidence has limits. A DNA match can demonstrate a biological connection between a person and evidence, but it does not automatically explain how or when the material was deposited. Investigators must interpret DNA results within the broader context of the entire investigation. This principle became especially important in complex cold cases. DNA could provide a critical lead, but detectives still needed to conduct interviews, examine records, verify timelines, and follow established legal procedures. The development of forensic DNA also prepared the foundation for later technologies, including investigative genetic genealogy. While traditional forensic DNA databases compare crime scene profiles against known reference databases, genetic genealogy uses relationships between individuals to identify potential family connections. This represented another major evolution in how investigators approached previously unsolved cases. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most recognized examples of how these scientific advances could be applied to a decades-old case. The investigation demonstrated the combined importance of preserved biological evidence, laboratory analysis, genealogical research, traditional detective work, and legal oversight. The broader lesson from the transformation of cold cases through DNA technology is that time does not always eliminate the possibility of justice. Scientific progress can change the meaning of evidence collected long before modern technology existed. An object stored in an evidence room for decades may contain information that earlier investigators could not access. For law enforcement agencies today, this history has changed investigative priorities. Evidence collection is no longer limited only to what current technology can analyze. Investigators preserve materials because future scientific developments may reveal answers that are currently impossible to obtain. The story of forensic DNA and cold cases is therefore not only about technology, it is about patience, preservation, scientific advancement, and cooperation across generations of investigators. The breakthroughs of modern forensic science were made possible because earlier professionals documented evidence carefully and maintained the possibility that someday new tools would uncover what was once hidden. The transformation of cold case investigations through forensic DNA was not limited to laboratory technology alone. A second major revolution occurred when law enforcement agencies began creating systems capable of storing, organizing, and comparing genetic information on a large scale. DNA databases changed the way investigators approached unsolved cases by allowing evidence collected in one investigation to be compared against information from thousands or millions of other records. Before DNA databases existed, detectives investigating an unsolved crime faced a difficult challenge. If investigators did not already have a suspect, they often had no direct way to determine whose biological material had been recovered from a crime scene. A DNA profile created in a laboratory could reveal that biological evidence came from an unknown person, but without a comparison sample. The investigation could remain unresolved. The creation of DNA databases introduced a new possibility: unknown evidence could become searchable information. In the United States, one of the most important developments was the creation of the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as developed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. CODIS allowed participating forensic laboratories to compare DNA profiles collected from eligible sources according to legal requirements. DNA ladder. DNA sample. 2000 BP. CODIS operates through several interconnected levels. Local laboratories can submit profiles from their jurisdictions, state laboratories maintain larger databases, and national-level comparisons allow information to be shared across participating states. This structure enables investigators to identify possible connections between cases that may have occurred in different locations and at different times. The impact on cold cases was significant. A crime that remained unsolved for years could potentially be resolved when a suspect's DNA profile entered a database because of a later conviction or other legally authorized collection. In some cases, investigators received a direct database match. In others, DNA databases revealed that evidence from multiple unsolved crimes came from the same unknown individual. This ability to connect investigations changed the traditional timeline of criminal cases. Previously, investigators often needed a suspect before forensic testing could become useful. DNA databases reversed that process. The biological evidence itself could generate investigative leads. However, DNA databases did not eliminate the need for traditional detective work. A database match generally provided an investigative direction rather than a complete explanation of events. Investigators still needed to confirm identity, establish timelines, collect additional evidence, and ensure that legal standards were met before pursuing criminal charges. The development of DNA databases also encouraged agencies to revisit older investigations. Many police departments began reviewing archived cases involving preserved biological evidence. Investigators examined whether evidence collected years earlier could now produce a DNA profile suitable for comparison. This process required careful evaluation. Not every historical sample could be successfully tested. Some evidence had degraded due to environmental conditions, improper storage, or limited original collection method. Other samples contained mixtures of DNA from multiple individuals, requiring advanced interpretation technique. Despite these challenges, thousands of cold cases benefited from improved DNA technology. Homicides, sexual assaults, missing person investigations, and unidentified remains cases were reopened because biological evidence previously considered inconclusive could now provide meaningful information. The evolution of DNA databases also changed cooperation between law enforcement agencies. A crime committed in one state could potentially be connected to evidence from another state through genetic comparison. This encouraged agencies to share information more effectively and recognize that criminal investigations often extended beyond traditional geographic boundaries. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated this principle. The crimes attributed to Joseph James D'Angelo involved multiple jurisdictions across California, requiring cooperation among different law enforcement agencies. DNA analysis helped establish connections among historical investigations and confirmed that evidence from separate cases was associated with the same unknown individual. While DNA databases provided powerful investigative capabilities, their use also introduced important questions about privacy, legal authority, and data management. Because DNA contains sensitive biological information, governments and scientific organizations developed policies regulating how genetic profiles could be collected, stored, accessed, and used. Unlike ordinary identifying information, DNA can reveal biological relationships and genetic characteristics. Therefore, responsible management of genetic databases became an essential part of maintaining public trust. Oversight, security procedures, access restrictions, and legal guidelines continue to shape how forensic DNA systems operate. Another important advancement was the development of probabilistic genotyping. Traditional DNA interpretation worked best when a single person's genetic profile was present. However, many crime scene samples contain DNA from multiple individuals. Mixed samples can be complex because genetic information overlaps. Probabilistic genotyping software uses mathematical models to evaluate possible explanations for complex DNA mixtures. These systems help forensic scientists estimate how likely different scenarios are, improving consistency in difficult cases. However, experts emphasize that software does not replace scientific judgment. Qualified analysts remain responsible for evaluating results and explaining conclusions. The growth of forensic DNA databases also influenced evidence collection practices. Police agencies became increasingly aware that biological evidence might remain valuable long after an investigation became inactive. Crime scene investigators received additional training in identifying potential DNA sources, preventing contamination, and preserving evidence for future analysis. This shift represented a broader change in investigative philosophy. Instead of viewing an unsolved case as permanently closed, agencies increasingly considered it a temporary status dependent on future scientific developments. The relationship between DNA databases and cold cases became especially important as technology continued advancing. Early DNA systems required larger samples and produced limited information. Later improvements allowed laboratories to obtain stronger results from smaller, older, or more challenging evidence. Advances in laboratory automation, statistical interpretation, and database searching increased both the speed and accuracy of forensic analysis. What once required months of work could increasingly be completed more efficiently, allowing investigators to examine larger numbers of historical cases. The success of DNA databases also influenced international criminal investigations. Many countries developed their own forensic DNA systems, allowing law enforcement agencies to compare evidence according to national laws and agreements. This international expansion demonstrated that genetic identification had become a fundamental component of modern forensic science. However, the most important lesson from the DNA database era is that technology works only when supported by careful investigative practices. A database cannot analyze evidence that was never collected. A laboratory cannot interpret a sample that was improperly preserved. A genetic profile cannot solve a case without investigators who understand how to apply scientific information responsibly. The evolution of forensic DNA databases transformed cold case investigations by creating a permanent connection between past evidence and future discovery. Evidence collected decades earlier could suddenly become relevant when new genetic information became available. Investigations once limited by geography and time could be expanded through scientific comparison. The result was a new era of criminal investigation, one where unanswered questions from the past could be revisited through the combined power of preserved evidence, advanced laboratory science, and coordinated information systems. The development of DNA databases became one of the most important steps in transforming cold cases from forgotten files into active investigations with renewed possibilities for resolution. The evolution of forensic DNA did not stop with traditional DNA databases. By the beginning of the 21st century, another scientific and investigative development began changing the way law enforcement approached some of the most difficult, unsolved cases in history: investigative genetic genealogy. While traditional forensic DNA methods compare a crime scene DNA profile against known law enforcement databases, investigative genetic genealogy uses genetic relationships to identify possible relatives of an unknown individual. This approach introduced a new way of thinking about unidentified DNA evidence. Instead of asking only, "Does this DNA match someone already known to police?" investigators began asking, "Can this DNA reveal a family connection that leads to the identity of the unknown person?" The foundation of genetic genealogy came from advances in consumer DNA testing. Beginning in the early 2000s, millions of people around the world voluntarily submitted DNA samples to private companies to learn about ancestry, family history, and genetic relationships. These databases were created for genealogical purposes rather than criminal investigations, but they contained information about family connections that could later become relevant in certain law enforcement investigations. Investigators recognized that DNA inheritance creates family patterns. A person's genetic profile contains information inherited from biological relatives, meaning an unknown individual's DNA may share identifiable segments with parents, siblings, cousins, or more distant relatives. By analyzing these shared genetic markers, researchers can sometimes construct family relationships and narrow possible identities. The technique became particularly valuable in cold cases where investigators already possessed a crime scene DNA profile but had no suspect match through traditional databases. For decades, some cases remained unresolved because the offender had never entered a law enforcement DNA system. Genetic genealogy created another possible pathway by using relatives rather than direct matching. The process required extensive research and careful analysis. Investigative teams began by examining genetic matches connected to an unknown DNA profile. These matches were not necessarily close relatives. In many cases, investigators had to work with distant genetic connections and combine DNA information with traditional genealogical research, including birth records, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and historical documents. Researchers constructed family trees spanning multiple generations. They examined relationships, geographic locations, ages, and historical information to identify individuals who could potentially match the unknown DNA profile. This process required both scientific knowledge and traditional investigative skill. Unlike a direct DNA database match, genetic genealogy did not instantly reveal a suspect's name. Instead, it produced investigative leads. Detectives still needed to verify information independently through conventional police work and additional forensic testing. The use of investigative genetic genealogy expanded rapidly after several high-profile cold cases demonstrated its potential. One of the most recognized examples was the identification of Joseph James D'Angelo in the Golden State Killer investigation in 2018. Investigators used a crime scene DNA profile and genealogical analysis to identify possible family connections, eventually narrowing their investigation toward D'Angelo. Traditional investigative methods and forensic confirmation were then used before authorities proceeded with an arrest. This case attracted worldwide attention because it demonstrated that decades-old investigations could be reopened through the combination of historical evidence and modern technology. It also encouraged law enforcement agencies to review other unsolved cases involving preserved biological evidence. However, the growth of investigative genetic genealogy also created important discussions about privacy, ethics, and legal oversight. Unlike traditional forensic DNA databases, which generally contain profiles collected under specific legal authority, consumer genealogy databases were created by individuals for personal ancestry research. Questions arose regarding how genetic information should be accessed, under what circumstances law enforcement should use it, and what protections should exist for individuals who submit DNA voluntarily. In response, law enforcement agencies, courts, policymakers, and professional organizations began developing guidelines for responsible use. These guidelines emphasize transparency, appropriate authorization, protection of privacy, and the need to balance investigative benefits with individual rights. Another important issue involved the interpretation of genetic information. Genetic genealogy relies on probability and relationship analysis rather than a direct identification method alone. Investigators must consider multiple possible family connections and carefully evaluate whether a genealogical lead is supported by additional evidence. The role of forensic laboratories remained essential. After genealogy produced a potential investigative direction, accredited laboratories conducted traditional forensic DNA comparisons to confirm whether biological evidence matched the individual being investigated. This separation between generating leads and proving identity helped maintain scientific standards. The success of genetic genealogy also changed the way agencies viewed historical evidence. Biological material collected decades earlier could become valuable again when combined with new analytical methods. Cases that had remained inactive for years were reconsidered because technology had expanded the possibilities. Cold case investigators began creating partnerships with forensic scientists, genealogists, legal experts, and researchers. These multidisciplinary teams represented a new model of investigation in which biology, technology, historical records, and traditional detective methods worked together. The impact extended beyond identifying offenders. Genetic genealogy has also assisted in identifying unknown human remains, helping families discover the identities of missing relatives and providing answers in cases that had remained unresolved for generations. Despite its success, experts continue emphasizing that genetic genealogy is not a replacement for traditional investigation. The technique depends on high-quality DNA evidence, accurate genetic interpretation, careful documentation, and responsible investigative practices. It is one tool among many within the broader field of forensic science. The development of investigative genetic genealogy represents another major stage in the transformation of cold cases. Early investigators preserved evidence without knowing how future science would use it. DNA profiling later revealed genetic information from that evidence. Databases created new comparison opportunities. Genetic genealogy expanded those possibilities by using relationships within human populations. Together, these advances changed the concept of an unsolved case. A file that once represented an investigative dead end could now contain evidence capable of producing new leads decades later. The history of forensic DNA demonstrates a recurring pattern in criminal investigation. Scientific progress builds upon the careful work of previous generations. The technologies available today exist because earlier investigators collected evidence, maintained records, and preserved materials according to professional standards. The transformation of cold cases through DNA and genetic genealogy is therefore not simply a story of advanced technology. It is a story of continuity between past and present, between investigators who preserved evidence decades ago and scientists who developed the tools capable of interpreting it today. As forensic science continues to evolve, new technologies will likely create additional opportunities for resolving historical investigations. The lessons learned from DNA-based cold case breakthroughs continue to influence modern policing. Preserve evidence carefully, apply science responsibly, and recognize that unanswered questions from the past may one day receive answers through discoveries that have not yet been imagined. The success of modern cold case investigations often depends on decisions made decades earlier. Long before advanced DNA technology existed, investigators collected, documented, and preserved evidence without knowing exactly how future science would analyze it. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA demonstrated that evidence does not necessarily lose its value with time. In many cases, the passage of years allowed science to catch up with questions that earlier investigators could not answer. The foundation of every DNA-based cold case investigation is evidence preservation. Biological material must survive long enough to be examined by future technologies. This requires proper collection methods, secure storage conditions, detailed documentation, and an unbroken chain of custody. During earlier decades, investigators collected biological evidence according to the scientific standards available at the time. Items such as clothing, biological swabs, weapons, and other materials were stored as part of official case files. Although many investigators could not predict the future capabilities of forensic science, preserving these materials created opportunities for later examination. As DNA technology improved, law enforcement agencies began reviewing historical evidence collections. Cold case investigators examined old files to determine whether preserved materials might produce new genetic information. This process required careful planning because not every item contained usable DNA, and not every sample could withstand modern testing procedures. The review of historical evidence became a specialized area of investigation. Detectives needed to understand the original circumstances of evidence collection, the limitations of previous laboratory testing, and the possibilities offered by newer scientific methods. They worked closely with forensic scientists to determine which items had the greatest potential value. This represented a major shift in investigative thinking. In earlier decades, an unsolved case often became inactive because all available leads had been exhausted. With DNA technology, however, investigators began viewing cold cases differently. A lack of answers did not necessarily mean a lack of evidence. It could mean that the available evidence had not yet been analyzed using the right technology. The process of reinvestigation usually began with a complete review of the original case file. Investigators examined crime scene reports, evidence inventories, laboratory results, witness statements, photographs, investigative notes, previous suspect information. This review allowed investigators to understand what had already been done and identify opportunities for additional analysis. One of the greatest challenges in cold case work is maintaining continuity across generations of investigators. A case that remains open for decades may involve multiple detectives, laboratory personnel, prosecutors, and agency. Personnel retire, departments change, and technology evolve. Detailed records allow new investigators to continue the work without losing important historical knowledge. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated the importance of this continuity. Evidence collected decades earlier remained available for advanced forensic testing because previous investigators had followed evidence preservation procedures. The eventual breakthrough was not created only by modern technology. It was made possible because earlier professionals maintained the foundation required for that technology to succeed. Another important development was the improvement of forensic laboratory capabilities. Early DNA testing required relatively large and well-preserved samples. Modern methods became increasingly sensitive, allowing scientists to examine smaller quantities of biological material and interpret more complex samples. Laboratories also improved their quality control procedures. Accreditation standards, validation studies, contamination prevention measures, and peer review processes became essential components of forensic DNA analysis. These improvements increased confidence in laboratory results and strengthened their use in criminal investigations and court proceedings. As DNA testing became more common, investigators also developed better methods for prioritizing cases. Not every cold case could immediately receive additional testing because resources were limited. Agencies evaluated factors such as availability of biological evidence, condition of preserved samples, severity of the crime, possibility of generating investigative leads, likelihood that new testing could provide meaningful information. This systematic approach allowed agencies to focus resources where scientific analysis had the greatest potential impact. The reinvestigation of cold cases also demonstrated the importance of combining forensic science with traditional detective work. DNA may identify a person connected to evidence, but investigators must still establish the circumstances surrounding that connection. They must examine timelines, locations, relationships, and additional evidence before reaching conclusion. This principle became especially important as DNA technology became more powerful. Scientific evidence provides information, but interpretation remains a critical part of the investigative process. Detectives and forensic experts must consider the entire body of evidence rather than relying on a single laboratory result. The growth of DNA-based investigations also changed law enforcement training. Modern investigators receive instruction in biological evidence collection, contamination prevention, forensic laboratory procedure, and the importance of preserving evidence for future analysis. Crime scenes are now approached with greater awareness that even small biological traces may become significant years later. Cold case investigations also benefited from increased cooperation between agencies. Historical cases often involve multiple jurisdictions, especially when crimes occurred over large geographic areas. Sharing information, laboratory results, and investigative resources allows agencies to identify connections that may have been impossible to recognize in the past. The evolution of forensic DNA has therefore transformed the meaning of time in criminal investigations. A case that remained unresolved for 30 or 40 years was no longer necessarily considered beyond reach. Scientific progress created new opportunities to examine old evidence and answer questions that had remained unanswered for generations. However, the use of DNA technology also reinforced the importance of ethical responsibility. investigators must ensure that evidence is analyzed properly, conclusions are supported by scientific methods, and individual rights are respected. The power of genetic information requires careful oversight and professional standards. The broader lesson from DNA-driven cold case investigations is that justice can depend on decisions made long before a breakthrough occurs. Evidence preservation, accurate documentation, and scientific discipline create possibilities for future discovery. The history of forensic DNA demonstrates a partnership between past and present. Earlier investigators provided the evidence and records. Modern scientists provided the technology to interpret them. Current investigators combine both resources to pursue answers. Cold cases once viewed as permanent mysteries have shown that time alone does not erase the possibility of resolution. As forensic science continues to advance, preserved evidence may reveal information that earlier generations could never access. The continuing evolution of DNA technology ensures that many unresolved investigations remain opportunities for discovery rather than forgotten chapters of history. The arrival of forensic DNA technology changed not only the tools available to investigators, but also the entire philosophy of criminal investigation. Before genetic analysis became widely used, many cold cases reached a point where detectives had exhausted every available lead. Files remained open, evidence was stored, and investigators hoped that a future witness, a new piece of information, or a scientific development might eventually provide answers. DNA transformed that waiting period into an opportunity for renewed investigation. The most important change was the ability to return to evidence that had previously reached its investigative limit. A fingerprint that could not be matched, a biological sample that could not be fully analyzed, or a piece of evidence that seemed inconclusive could later become significant when new forensic methods became available. This created a new approach to criminal justice, the idea that an unsolved case was not necessarily a finished investigation, but a case waiting for the right technology. During the early decades of forensic DNA use, investigators focused primarily on creating reliable genetic profiles from crime scene evidence. As laboratories improved their techniques, DNA became more sensitive, more accurate, and more widely available. The technology moved from a specialized scientific process into a central component of modern law enforcement. One of the greatest advantages of DNA analysis was its ability to establish connections that traditional investigations could not reveal. Biological evidence could show that to separate crime scenes involved the same unknown individual, even when those crimes occurred years apart or in different jurisdictions. This ability transformed the way agencies viewed patterns of criminal activity. Previously, detectives relied heavily on communication, memory, and manual comparison of case files. DNA provided an objective biological link that could connect investigations without requiring investigators to already know the relationship between them. As forensic databases expanded, the impact became even greater. A DNA profile from an unknown offender could remain stored as an investigative reference until a future comparison became possible. A person who had not been identified at the time of an offense might later become known because of a separate investigation, a lawful DNA collection, or advancements in genetic analysis. Cold case investigations increasingly became collaborative efforts involving multiple specialists. Modern teams often include detectives, forensic scientists, crime analysts, prosecutors, digital evidence experts, and genealogical researchers. Each discipline contributes different information to create a complete investigative picture. This multidisciplinary approach represents a significant change from earlier decades when investigations were often managed primarily by individual detectives or local departments. Complex cold cases demonstrated that cooperation across agencies and professional fields could produce results that would not have been possible through isolated effort. The use of DNA also changed how law enforcement agencies managed evidence. Instead of considering evidence valuable only for immediate analysis, agencies increasingly recognized the importance of long-term preservation. Proper storage conditions, documentation, and chain of custody procedures became essential because future scientific advances could provide new opportunities. This lesson influenced crime scene procedures around the world. Investigators became more careful about collecting biological material, preventing contamination, and recording every step of evidence handled. The possibility that evidence might be analyzed decades later became a standard consideration during investigation. Another important impact of DNA technology was the ability to challenge previous assumptions. In some cases, individuals suspected through traditional investigative methods were excluded through DNA testing. This demonstrated that forensic science could protect against investigative errors as well as help identify offenders. DNA evidence introduced a higher standard of scientific evaluation. Investigators and courts increasingly required conclusions based on measurable biological evidence rather than relying only on human memory, interpretation, or circumstantial theories. However, DNA technology also required careful interpretation. A genetic connection between a person and evidence does not automatically explain the circumstances surrounding that evidence. Investigators must still determine how the evidence relates to the overall case. Forensic experts therefore emphasize that DNA is powerful but not independent of context. The meaning of a DNA result depends on proper collection, laboratory procedures, statistical interpretation, and investigative circumstances. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most widely discussed examples of how modern forensic science could influence a historical investigation. The case demonstrated how preserved biological evidence, advanced DNA analysis, genealogical research, and traditional detective methods could work together after decades had passed. The importance of the case extended beyond one investigation. It encouraged law enforcement agencies worldwide to examine their own unresolved cases and consider whether advances in science might provide new opportunities. Many agencies began reviewing archived evidence collections and creating specialized cold case programs. The rise of forensic DNA also changed public understanding of criminal investigations. For many people, cold cases had traditionally represented mysteries that might never be solved. DNA technology introduced a different possibility, that answers could emerge years later through scientific progress. At the same time, society began debating the responsibilities that come with powerful genetic technology. Issues involving privacy, consent, database management, and the appropriate use of genetic information became important discussions among scientists, legal experts, policymakers, and the public. These debates reflected the unique nature of DNA. Unlike many forms of evidence, genetic information contains information about biological relationships. Responsible use requires balancing investigative value with individual privacy rights. As forensic technology continues developing, DNA analysis is becoming even more advanced. New techniques allow scientists to examine smaller samples, interpret complex mixtures, and extract information from evidence that would previously have been considered unsuitable for testing. Artificial intelligence and improved statistical methods are also beginning to influence forensic analysis. These tools assist scientists in evaluating large amounts of information, recognizing patterns, and improving efficiency. However, human expertise and scientific oversight remain essential. The transformation of cold cases through DNA represents a broader story about the relationship between science and justice. Technology alone does not solve investigation. Breakthroughs occur when scientific capability is combined with careful evidence collection, accurate documentation, professional investigation, and legal standard. Every solved cold case built upon years of work by many people. Crime scene investigators preserved evidence. Laboratory scientists developed new methods. Detectives maintained files and continued searching for answers. Future investigators applied technologies that earlier generations could only imagine. The history of forensic DNA shows that unresolved cases are not simply forgotten investigations. They are records containing information that may become understandable when science advances. The most important lesson from the DNA revolution is that time does not always eliminate evidence. In many cases, time allows science to develop the tools necessary to finally interpret what was there all along. For modern criminal investigations, forensic DNA represents more than a laboratory technique. It represents a connection between past evidence and future discoveries, a scientific bridge that allows investigators to revisit old questions with new possibilities for answers. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA has changed the way the criminal justice system understands evidence, time, and the possibility of resolution. What began as a revolutionary laboratory technique in the 1980s has developed into a broad investigative science combining genetics, computer analysis, databases, genealogy, and advanced forensic methods. The history of DNA-based investigations demonstrates a fundamental principle. Evidence does not lose its importance simply because years have passed. Instead, the value of evidence can increase as science develops new ways to interpret it. The earliest generations of forensic DNA analysis focus primarily on identifying individuals through genetic profiles. Modern forensic science has expanded beyond simple identification and now explores more complex questions involving degraded samples, mixed DNA profiles, unidentified remains, and historical evidence. One major area of continued development is the analysis of challenging DNA samples. Many older cold cases involve evidence that has been stored for decades. Environmental exposure, temperature changes, moisture, and limited original collection methods can affect biological material over time. Modern laboratories continue developing techniques designed to recover useful information from samples that previous technologies could not analyze. Advanced DNA sequencing represents one of the next stages in forensic science. Traditional STR analysis examines specific regions of DNA selected for identification purposes. Newer sequencing methods examine genetic information at a deeper level, potentially providing additional information from complex or degraded samples. Although these technologies continue developing, forensic scientists emphasize that every method must undergo rigorous validation before being used in criminal investigation. Accuracy, reliability, and scientific transparency remain essential because forensic evidence can have significant legal consequences. Another important area of development involves improved interpretation of complex DNA mixtures. Crime scene samples may contain genetic material from multiple individuals, making analysis challenging. Scientists continue improving statistical models and software tools that help evaluate these complicated samples. Modern forensic interpretation increasingly relies on probability-based approaches. Instead of simply stating whether evidence matches or does not match, scientists use statistical methods to explain how strongly the evidence supports different possible explanations. This allows courts and investigators to understand the significance of DNA findings more accurately. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are also becoming part of forensic research. These technologies may assist scientists by organizing large amounts of information, identifying patterns, and improving efficiency in laboratory workflow. However, artificial intelligence does not replace forensic experts. Human oversight remains essential because scientific conclusions require interpretation, quality control, and professional judgment. Technology can assist investigators, but it does not eliminate the need for trained specialists. The continued growth of forensic DNA has also expanded international cooperation. Criminal investigations increasingly cross geographic boundaries, and DNA databases allow agencies in different regions to identify possible connections between cases. This global cooperation is particularly important for investigations involving missing persons, unidentified remains, and crimes that may involve movement across jurisdictions. Shared scientific standards and communication between agencies increase the possibility of resolving cases that once appeared impossible to solve. Another significant development is the increasing focus on ethical standards. As DNA technology becomes more powerful, questions regarding privacy, consent, and genetic information management become increasingly important. Unlike traditional evidence, DNA contains information about biological relationships. The use of genetic information must therefore balance investigative benefits with protections for individual rights. Professional organizations, legal authorities, and scientific institutions continue developing guidelines to ensure that forensic DNA is used responsibly. These discussions involve questions about database access, genetic genealogy, data security, and the appropriate limits of investigative use. The experience of major cold case investigations has influenced how law enforcement agencies approach evidence today. Modern investigators recognize that biological evidence collected during an investigation may remain valuable for decades. This awareness has changed crime scene procedures worldwide. Evidence collection now involves greater attention to preventing contamination, maintaining proper documentation, preserving biological samples, recording chain of custody, coordinating with forensic laboratories. These practices ensure that future scientific developments can be applied effectively. The evolution of forensic DNA has also changed the role of cold case investigators. Rather than simply reviewing old files, modern cold case teams actively search for new opportunities. They examine whether advances in technology, databases, or analytical methods can provide information unavailable during the original investigation. This approach has created a new relationship between past and present investigators' detectives. From earlier decades, provided the foundation by collecting evidence and maintaining records. New generations of investigators apply modern science to that preserved information. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most recognized examples of this process. The case demonstrated how historical evidence, DNA analysis, genealogical research, and traditional investigative methods could combine to resolve a decades-old investigation. Its impact extended beyond one case by encouraging law enforcement agencies to reconsider the possibilities of unresolved investigations worldwide. However, experts emphasize that not every cold case can be solved through DNA. Some investigations lack biological evidence. Others involve samples that cannot produce a usable profile. Some cases require additional witnesses, documents, or investigative breakthroughs unrelated to genetics. DNA is powerful, but it is one component of a larger investigative system. The future of cold case investigations will likely involve the continued integration of multiple technologies. Digital evidence analysis, improved forensic databases, advanced laboratory technique, and international information sharing will all contribute to future investigation. At the same time, the foundation of successful investigations will remain unchanged. Careful evidence collection, accurate documentation, professional analysis, and respect for legal standards will continue to determine whether scientific advances can produce meaningful results. The story of forensic DNA and cold cases is ultimately a story about patience and progress. Investigators who preserved evidence decades ago created opportunities they could not have predicted. Scientists who developed new technologies provided tools that transformed historical investigation. Modern detectives combine these resources to pursue answers that once seemed unreachable. The continuing evolution of forensic science shows that unresolved cases are not necessarily forgotten cases. They represent questions that may remain open until technology, investigation, and opportunity come together. As science continues advancing, evidence collected today may contain answers that future generations will discover. The next breakthrough in forensic investigation may come from technologies that are still being developed, just as DNA profiling once transformed the meaning of a cold case. The impact of forensic DNA is therefore not limited to the cases it has already helped solve. Its greatest influence may come from the possibilities it creates for investigations that remain unanswered today. Through continued scientific innovation, careful evidence preservation, and responsible investigative practices, the future of cold case resolution continues to expand. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA is often described in terms of technology, laboratories, and scientific breakthroughs. However, behind every DNA profile, every evidence examination, and every investigative development are real people whose lives have been affected by unresolved questions for years or even decades. For families of victims, a cold case represents more than an unfinished investigation. It represents years of uncertainty, unanswered questions, and the emotional burden of not knowing what happened. The development of forensic DNA created new possibilities for these families by providing investigators with tools that previous generations did not have. The impact of DNA technology extends beyond identifying unknown individuals. It has changed how law enforcement agencies approach families, how investigators review historical cases, and how society understands the pursuit of justice over long periods of time. In many cold cases, families maintained hope despite the passage of years. Traditional investigative methods may have produced important information, but without definitive evidence, uncertainty often remained. DNA technology introduced a scientific pathway that could transform unanswered questions into measurable evidence. The ability to revisit old evidence became one of the most important aspects of modern forensic investigation. A case that had remained inactive for decades could be reopened when new laboratory methods became available. Investigators could return to preserved evidence not because earlier work had been inadequate, but because science had developed beyond the limitations of the past. The relationship between investigators and forensic scientists became increasingly important during this process. Detectives provide historical context, investigative records, and information about the original case. Scientists provide laboratory expertise and explain what evidence can and cannot reveal. Together, they form a partnership that allows old investigations to benefit from modern knowledge. This cooperation also changed the role of forensic laboratories. Laboratories are no longer viewed simply as places where evidence is tested after an investigation. They have become active partners in investigative strategy, helping agencies determine which evidence should be examined, what technology should be applied, and how results should be interpreted. The success of DNA-based investigations also influenced public confidence in forensic science. For many people, DNA became a symbol of objective evidence because genetic analysis is based on measurable biological information rather than memory or personal interpretation. However, experts emphasize that DNA evidence must always be evaluated carefully. While DNA can provide powerful information, it must be considered within the full context of an investigation. Proper collection, laboratory procedures, statistical interpretation, and legal standards are all necessary to ensure accurate conclusions. The growth of DNA technology also changed the role of prosecutors and courts. Legal professionals increasingly needed to understand scientific evidence, including how DNA profiles are created, how probabilities are calculated, and how forensic results should be presented to judges and jurors. This required closer cooperation between scientists and the legal system. Forensic experts must explain complex scientific concepts clearly while maintaining accuracy and avoiding exaggerated conclusions. Another major impact of forensic DNA has been the review of wrongful convictions. Before DNA testing became widely available, some individuals were convicted based on evidence that later proved unreliable or incomplete. DNA analysis provided a powerful method for re-examining cases and determining whether previous conclusions were supported by biological evidence. These cases demonstrated that forensic science serves two important purposes: identifying individuals responsible for crimes and protecting individuals who may have been wrongly accused. The evolution of DNA technology also influenced how law enforcement agencies manage unresolved investigations. Many agencies established dedicated cold case units responsible for reviewing historical cases, maintaining communication with families, and evaluating whether new scientific methods could provide additional information. These units often combine experienced detectives with younger investigators who bring knowledge of modern technology. This combination of historical experience and contemporary scientific understanding has become a defining feature of successful cold case work. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most recognized examples of how forensic DNA could transform a decades-old case. The investigation demonstrated that evidence collected many years earlier could become valuable again through advances in genetic analysis and investigative methods. Its significance extended beyond the identification of one individual. The case encouraged agencies worldwide to review their own unresolved investigations and consider whether preserved biological evidence might provide new opportunities. At the same time, the increased use of genetic technology created important discussions about privacy and ethics. DNA is not simply another type of identifying information. It contains biological information connected to individuals and their relatives. As a result, responsible use of genetic information became a central issue in modern forensic science. Investigators, scientists, lawmakers, and privacy advocates continue discussing how to balance the benefits of solving serious crimes with the protection of personal genetic information. Transparency became increasingly important. Public trust depends on clear rules regarding how DNA information is collected, stored, accessed, and used. Strong oversight and professional standards help ensure that forensic technology is applied responsibly. Another important legacy of DNA-based investigations is the recognition that solving a cold case often requires multiple generations of effort. The investigators who originally collected evidence may never have known whether their work would produce results. Scientists developing new technologies could not predict every future application. Modern investigators build upon both forms of effort. This connection between past and present represents one of the most important lessons of forensic science. Every careful evidence collection decision, every detailed report, and every preserved sample contributes to future possibilities. The transformation of cold cases through DNA is therefore not only a scientific story, it is a story about persistence, collaboration, and the belief that unresolved questions deserve continued attention. Modern forensic science has changed expectations surrounding cold cases. Decades ago, an unsolved investigation might have been considered permanently beyond reach. Today, advances in technology have shown that time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of answers. The future will likely bring additional breakthroughs, new sequencing methods, improved analytical tools, artificial intelligence, and expanded scientific collaboration may allow investigators to examine evidence in ways that are currently impossible. Yet the fundamental principles will remain the same. Evidence must be preserved. Investigations must be conducted carefully. Scientific conclusions must be supported by reliable methods. Victims and families must remain at the center of the process. The legacy of forensic DNA is not only measured by the cases it has helped resolve, it is also measured by the change it created in how society views justice. It demonstrated that unanswered questions can remain active, that evidence can regain meaning with time, and that scientific progress can provide new opportunities where none previously existed. The transformation of cold cases through DNA represents the meeting point between human determination and scientific discovery. It shows that even after decades have passed, the search for truth can continue and that the evidence preserved from the past may still hold the answers of the future. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA has changed the way investigators, scientists, and society understand the possibility of solving crimes that once appeared impossible to resolve. The development of DNA technology did not simply introduce a new laboratory method. It changed investigative strategy, reshaped evidence management, and created a new relationship between past investigations and future scientific discovery. For decades, many cold cases remained unresolved because investigators had reached the limits of the tools available at the time. They collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, followed leads, and examined every possible connection. But some questions remained unanswered. The arrival of forensic DNA created a new opportunity. Evidence that had already been collected could be examined again with technologies that did not exist when the investigation began. One of the most important lessons from the DNA revolution is the value of preserving evidence. Every cold case breakthrough depends on the existence of reliable evidence. Without careful collection, documentation, and storage, future technologies cannot provide new answers. The investigators who handled evidence decades earlier often worked without knowing what scientific capabilities would eventually become available. They followed procedures designed according to the knowledge of their time. Their careful work created a foundation that allowed later generations of scientists and detectives to continue the search for answers. This principle has become central to modern policing. Today, investigators understand that evidence collection is not only about solving the current investigation, it is also about preserving possibilities for the future. Modern crime scenes are approached with greater awareness of biological evidence. Investigators consider that even small traces of DNA may become valuable years later. Collection methods, packaging procedures, storage conditions, and documentation standards have all improved because of lessons learned from historical investigation. Another major lesson from forensic DNA is the importance of collaboration. Complex cold cases rarely involve only one agency or one area of expertise. Successful investigations often require cooperation between detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, database specialists, analysts, and other professionals. The development of DNA technology encouraged agencies to share information more effectively. Crimes that once appeared separate because they occurred in different locations could be connected through biological evidence. This changed how investigators identified patterns and understood the movement of offenders across jurisdictions. The growth of forensic databases demonstrated the power of information sharing. A DNA profile collected in one investigation could become important years later when compared with information from another case. This created a network of evidence that extended beyond traditional geographic boundaries. However, the history of DNA-based investigations also highlighted the importance of responsible scientific interpretation. DNA is powerful evidence, but it must be evaluated carefully. A genetic result requires context, statistical analysis, and professional interpretation. Forensic experts continue emphasizing that DNA should not be viewed as an automatic answer to every investigation. It is one part of a larger process that includes traditional detective work, witness information, physical evidence, and legal evaluation. The evolution of DNA technology also changed the role of investigators. Modern detectives working on cold cases must understand not only traditional investigative methods, but also the possibilities and limitations of forensic science. This has led to specialized training programs designed to help investigators recognize opportunities for new analysis. Detectives reviewing decades-old case files now consider questions that earlier investigators could not ask. Could preserved evidence produce a DNA profile today? Could improved laboratory techniques provide additional information? Could new databases or analytical methods reveal connections that were previously hidden? These questions have transformed the approach to historical investigation. The development of investigative genetic genealogy further expanded the possibilities of DNA-based investigations by examining biological relationships rather than only direct database matching. Investigators gained another method for identifying unknown individuals connected to historical evidence. This advancement also created new responsibilities. Genetic information involves privacy concerns that require careful consideration. The use of genealogy databases in investigations has encouraged important discussions about consent, transparency, and appropriate legal oversight. The future of forensic DNA will likely involve even greater integration with other technologies. Advanced sequencing, improved statistical models, artificial intelligence, and expanded international cooperation may provide investigators with tools that are currently beyond imagination. However, technology alone will never replace the fundamental elements of investigation. The most advanced laboratory method still depends on evidence being collected correctly. The most powerful database still requires accurate information. The most sophisticated software still requires qualified professionals who understand how to interpret results. The lessons of forensic DNA also extend beyond solving crimes. DNA analysis has contributed to identifying missing persons, resolving unidentified remains cases, and providing answers to families who have waited years for information. This broader humanitarian impact demonstrates that forensic science serves multiple purposes. It supports criminal investigations, helps families find closure, and contributes to a more accurate understanding of historical events. The Golden State Killer investigation became a significant example of how these lessons came together. The investigation demonstrated that biological evidence preserved from decades earlier could become central to a modern breakthrough. It showed the importance of combining forensic science with traditional investigative methods and highlighted the continuing evolution of cold case work. But the larger importance of such investigations is not limited to one case. They represent a change in how society views unresolved crimes. A cold case is no longer necessarily a forgotten case. It may be an investigation waiting for scientific progress. This shift has influenced law enforcement agencies around the world. Departments increasingly invest in cold case units, forensic training, evidence preservation programs, and partnerships with scientific institutions. The future of criminal investigation will continue to depend on this relationship between science and persistence. New technologies will create new opportunities, but those opportunities will only exist because investigators preserve evidence, maintain records, and continue searching for answers. The story of forensic DNA in cold cases is ultimately a story about time. Evidence collected in the past can become meaningful in the future. Questions unanswered for decades can be reconsidered. Investigations once limited by technology can be expanded through scientific advancement. The greatest lesson is that justice does not always follow a predictable timeline. Some answers arrive quickly. Others require decades of patience, innovation, and cooperation. Forensic DNA transformed cold cases by proving that time does not always erase evidence. It showed that science can create connections across generations of investigators and that the work done today may provide answers for tomorrow. As forensic technology continues to advance, the possibility remains that many unresolved cases still contain information waiting to be discovered. The future of cold case investigations will be shaped by the same principles that define the DNA revolution. Preserve carefully, investigate thoroughly, apply science responsibly, and never assume that an unanswered question will remain unanswered forever. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA represents one of the most significant changes in the history of modern criminal investigation. What began as a scientific breakthrough in genetic identification developed into a complete investigative revolution, changing how evidence is collected, preserved, analyzed, and interpreted. For decades, investigators faced a painful reality. Some cases remained unresolved despite extraordinary efforts. Detectives followed leads, interviewed witnesses, examined physical evidence, and searched for answers. Yet certain investigations reached a point where traditional methods could go no further. The passage of time created additional obstacles. Memories faded, witnesses became unavailable, records disappeared, and suspects remained unidentified. Evidence collected decades earlier could suddenly become meaningful because science had developed the ability to examine biological material in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. A sample that once provided no clear answer could later reveal a genetic profile. A connection that remained hidden for years could become visible through improved technology. This transformation changed the definition of a cold case. Instead of representing an investigation that had simply failed, a cold case became an investigation that might be waiting for the next scientific advancement. One of the greatest lessons from the DNA era is the importance of patience and preservation. Many successful cold case investigations depended on evidence that had survived for years because investigators carefully collected and stored material. According to professional standards, those decisions created opportunities for future breakthroughs. The investigators who worked these cases in earlier decades often operated without the tools available today. They could not know that advances in molecular biology, computer analysis, and genetic research would eventually provide new methods of investigation. Their contribution was preserving the possibility that future science could continue the search. Modern forensic science has built upon that foundation. Today, investigators understand that evidence collection is not only about solving a case immediately, it is also about protecting information that may become valuable years later. Crime scene procedures now emphasize careful documentation, contamination prevention, secure storage, and complete records of evidence handling. These practices reflect one of the most important changes brought by forensic DNA, the recognition that evidence has a long life. The evolution of DNA technology also transformed cooperation between different areas of law enforcement. Historical investigations often involve separate agencies, different jurisdictions, and independent case files. DNA analysis created new opportunities to identify relationships between investigations that previously appeared unrelated. A biological profile could connect evidence from different locations, different years, and different investigative files. This changed how agencies viewed criminal patterns and encouraged greater information sharing. The development of DNA databases strengthened this connection. Systems designed to compare genetic profiles allowed investigators to search for relationships between unknown evidence and known samples collected under legal authority. However, DNA databases also demonstrated an important principle. Technology alone does not solve crimes. A database can provide information, but investigators must still interpret that information, verify evidence, and follow legal procedures. The most successful investigations combined scientific analysis with traditional detective work. Detectives still needed to understand the history of a case, evaluate witness information, examine records, reconstruct events, and determine how scientific findings fit within the broader investigation. This balance between science and investigation became one of the defining features of modern cold case work. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy expanded these possibilities even further. By examining biological relationship, investigators gained another method for generating leads in cases where traditional DNA databases did not produce direct matches. This development demonstrated how quickly forensic science continues to evolve. A method that did not exist during the original investigation could later become the key to identifying information hidden within preserved evidence. At the same time, the growth of genetic technology created important ethical responsibilities. DNA contains deeply personal information, not only about individuals, but also about their biological relative. The use of genetic data requires careful consideration of privacy, consent, security, and legal oversight. The future of forensic DNA will depend not only on scientific innovation, but also on responsible implementation. Public trust remains essential. People must have confidence that genetic information is handled carefully, that scientific methods are reliable, and that investigative tools are used within appropriate legal boundaries. The impact of forensic DNA extends beyond identifying offenders. It has also helped resolve cases involving unidentified remains, missing persons, and wrongful conviction. In these situations, DNA provides answers not only for investigators, but also for families searching for information. This broader humanitarian role demonstrates that forensic science is not solely about prosecution. It is also about truth, accuracy, and understanding. The lessons learned from decades of DNA-based investigations continue shaping the future of criminal justice. First, evidence matters. Something collected today may become important tomorrow. Second, collaboration matters. Complex investigations require cooperation between scientists, detectives, legal professionals, and specialized experts. Third, scientific progress matters. New technologies can reveal information that previous generations could not access. Finally, persistence matters. Many cold cases were solved because investigators continued searching long after the original investigation had reached a dead end. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most recognized examples of this transformation. Its significance was not only the eventual identification of a suspect after decades of investigation, but also the demonstration of how preserved evidence, modern DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and traditional investigative methods could work together. The broader lesson from such cases is that justice can follow a long and unpredictable path. A case may remain unresolved for years. Evidence may sit untouched in storage. Investigators may retire without seeing the final outcome, yet the information contained within preserved evidence can remain valuable. As forensic technology continues to advance, future generations of investigators may solve cases that today still appear impossible. New sequencing methods, improved analytical tools, artificial intelligence systems, and expanded scientific cooperation may reveal answers that cannot currently be obtained. But even as technology changes, the foundation remains the same: careful investigation, accurate documentation, responsible science, respect for victims and family. The story of forensic DNA and cold cases is ultimately a story about the connection between the past and the future. Evidence collected decades ago can become the key to modern discovery. Questions left unanswered for generations can eventually find answers through scientific progress. The transformation of cold cases through forensic DNA has proven one powerful idea: time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes, Time allows science to develop the tools needed to uncover it.